The sea is a world of its own, a liquid battlefield where wood, bronze, and human flesh collide in moments of terror and brilliance. It is not a theater for hesitation. It is unforgiving. The Mediterranean, often called the cradle of civilization, was also the crucible of some of history's most decisive naval confrontations. Here, empires rose and fell, not on the land they controlled, but on the strength, skill, and courage of men who rowed, steered, and fought entirely at sea. And nowhere was this more evident than during the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, where the fate of Greece teetered on the edge of waves. Imagine a narrow strait, barely wide enough for hundreds of ships to maneuver. The early morning sun reflects off the calm surface, hiding the tension beneath. A massive Persian fleet, perhaps 3 times the size of the Greek armada, stretches across the horizon, countless triremes bristling with bronze rams and armed men. Thousands of rowers are confined in the lower decks, their muscles taut, lungs burning, their eyes barely glimpsing daylight as they prepare for what will be the most consequential naval clash in centuries. On the opposite end, the Greek fleet waits, smaller in number but disciplined, positioned with intimate knowledge of the strait's treacherous currents and hidden shoals. This is not just a confrontation of ships. It is a confrontation of strategy, courage, and survival itself. The Greeks understood a fundamental truth of naval warfare that the Persians had underestimated. Control of the water was not determined by size alone. Speed, maneuverability, and coordination could nullify superior numbers. Triremes, the ancient warships of this era, were designed for precision and impact. Each ship carried 3 banks of oars, each rower contributing raw human force to propel the vessel forward at astonishing speed. Above, marines waited on deck with spears and shields, ready to board enemy ships or repel attacks. At the bow, the bronze ram gleamed, poised to pierce hulls with deadly efficiency. One well-timed strike could sink an enemy vessel in seconds, sending dozens of men into the frigid waters below. The Persian fleet, despite its massive size, struggled with coordination. Each trireme required careful handling. Without synchronization, the vessels risked collisions or drifting into shallow waters where shoals would shred hulls. The narrowness of the strait compounded these problems. Ships crammed against one another like bloodied gladiators, unable to maneuver freely. Panic could spread as easily as fire on a wooden deck, and panic at sea is unforgiving. Even the strongest warriors were vulnerable to waves, bronze, and human error. When the signal was given, the Greek fleet surged forward with terrifying precision. Oars sliced through water in near-perfect unison. Captains called commands that echoed across the strait, voices sharp with urgency. The first collisions were catastrophic. Persian ships, trapped by the confined waters, were rammed repeatedly. Bronze rams pierced hulls, wooden frames splintered, and the screams of men echoed above the lapping of the waves. Survivors struggled to cling to floating debris, only to be crushed or drowned as the battle churned on. The Greeks used their smaller size to their advantage, pivoting quickly, striking where the Persian fleet was weakest, and then retreating before being overwhelmed. Boarding engagements followed. Greek marines leapt across gaps, shields clashing against bronze armor, spears stabbing with brutal efficiency. Each ship became a microcosm of warfare, a tiny battlefield floating atop waves. Coordination, discipline, and morale proved decisive. The larger Persian fleet, despite its numbers, could not maintain cohesion. Confusion spread. Some captains attempted to flee, only to collide with allies or be pushed into rocks by currents. By midday, the Persian armada was shattered, hundreds of ships lost, thousands of men dead or captured. The Greeks had turned the narrow waters of Salamis into a trap so perfect that the sheer scale of the Persian fleet became its undoing. The aftermath was as significant as the battle itself. The Persian threat to Greece was broken, giving the city-states time to recover and preserve their independence. But more importantly, Salamis demonstrated the evolution of naval warfare. The Mediterranean had become a theater where intellect and skill could outweigh sheer numbers. The battle also solidified the trireme as the dominant warship of the era, a vessel engineered entirely for the art of combat at sea. Its design would influence naval engagements for centuries, its tactics studied by generations of commanders who understood that victory on water required more than courage. It demanded precision, timing, and intimate knowledge of the sea itself. The psychological impact of Salamis cannot be overstated. Sailors and rowers, packed in 3 tiers of oars, experienced fear unlike any on land. They were enclosed, almost blind, yet entirely dependent on coordination and trust. A single mistake by one rower could turn a disciplined attack into disaster. Panic could ripple through a ship in seconds, and the narrow straits amplified these risks. The battle was won not only through strategy, but through mental fortitude and unflinching discipline. Salamis was also a lesson in geography as a weapon. Knowledge of currents, shoals, and the strait's width allowed the Greeks to manipulate the battlefield. Ships could be lured into traps, corners where ramming was lethal and escape nearly impossible. Geography itself became a force multiplier, turning the natural environment into an ally. Every naval commander after would recognize that understanding the sea was as critical as mastering the ships themselves. Yet Salamis was only the beginning. The Mediterranean, with its countless islands, straits, and reefs, would see centuries of combat where fleets collided with similar ferocity. Each subsequent engagement, from Aegospotami to Actium, built upon the lessons learned here. The importance of speed, maneuverability, crew coordination, and the deadly efficiency of well-timed ramming and boarding actions. The Greeks proved that a smaller, disciplined force could outmatch a larger one if it understood the nuances of the sea and the potential of its vessels. The human cost of these early naval battles was staggering. Each trireme carried dozens of rowers, marines, and officers. Casualty rates were high, not just from enemy action, but from the sea itself. Waves, splintered wood, and overturned vessels claimed many more than the weapons aboard. Survivors were left clinging to wreckage, enduring exposure and thirst until rescue or death. These were not faceless losses. Each ship carried families, communities, and futures, all dependent on success at sea. Naval warfare was total, encompassing both skill and survival, intellect and endurance. The legacy of Salamis extended beyond tactics and technology. It influenced the rise of Athens as a naval power, shaping politics, economics, and culture. Control of the sea allowed the city-state to expand influence, secure trade routes, and project power. The Mediterranean itself became not just a body of water, but a stage where empires tested their mettle, economies were sustained, and civilizations clashed. Commanders who mastered the sea held leverage over both life and death, not only in war, but in the very sustenance of their cities. In retrospect, the Battle of Salamis illustrates a fundamental truth about the Mediterranean. Mastery of the sea is mastery over history. Geography, technology, human courage, and tactical genius converge to determine outcomes far beyond individual battles. Ships are more than vessels. They are instruments of strategy, engines of power, and crucibles of human endurance. The Mediterranean is not merely a passageway for commerce. It is an arena where entire civilizations confront each other, where the waves themselves decide fates, and where the echo of each oar stroke can alter the course of history. As we begin this series on legendary naval battles, Salamis stands as the ultimate introduction. It encapsulates the brutality, ingenuity, and human drama that define Mediterranean maritime history. Every battle to follow, from triremes to galleys to cannon-laden ships, builds upon the lessons of Salamis: coordination, speed, understanding of the sea, and above all, the courage and discipline of men who rode into the jaws of death with only bronze, wood, and sheer determination at their side. The Mediterranean is a world of water and warfare, and the story of its battles is the story of survival, strategy, and human ambition. The sea never sleeps, and neither did the Greek resolve after the crushing victory at Salamis. While the Persian fleet had been shattered in the straits, the remnants had not been fully destroyed. Ships that survived had retreated to the eastern Aegean and Ionian coasts, carrying the remnants of men, equipment, and the shadow of ambition. It was here, near the slopes of Mount Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, that the Greeks would strike again, turning their momentary victory into a strategic annihilation. Unlike Salamis, where they defended narrow waters against overwhelming odds at Mycale, the Greeks would take the offensive, bringing their mastery of the sea to bear on the enemy, in open waters a theater still treacherous, with currents, shoals, and sudden storms. The Greek fleet, now emboldened and organized after Salamis, moved deliberately across the Aegean. Commanders coordinated rowers and marines trained to respond instantly to signals, to shifts in wind and tide, and to the unpredictable movements of the surviving Persian triremes. Each Greek ship was a disciplined machine of wood, bronze, and muscle, carrying dozens of rowers beneath decks and armed marines above. The bronze rams at the bow glimmered under the Mediterranean sun, instruments designed to pierce hulls and shatter formations. Precision mattered as much as strength. Every command had to be obeyed instantly. The sea afforded no second chances. On the morning of engagement, the waters off Mycale were deceptively calm, reflecting the mountains and clouds with an almost serene surface. But beneath that placid veneer lurked the potential for chaos. Waves could surge unpredictably, currents could pull a ship off course, and a single navigational error could turn a disciplined attack into disaster. The Persian fleet, diminished but still formidable, waited near their fortified encampments along the coast. Their ships, though fewer, were manned by crews still experienced in the brutalities of war, disciplined and heavily armed. The Greeks knew that a frontal assault would test their skills, but a retreat was unthinkable. Momentum, after all, is the lifeblood of naval warfare. The Greek commanders, including the prominent Spartan leaders who had survived Salamis, devised a multi-pronged strategy. The fleet would advance in tight formations, maximizing the offensive potential of each trireme while minimizing exposure to enemy ramming. Rowers bent to their oars in perfect unison, turning human effort into deadly propulsion. The bronze rams were angled to strike the hulls at weak points, while marines prepared for boarding actions, ready to leap across decks and fight in brutal close quarters. The Greeks understood that victory at Mycale would not come from overwhelming numbers, but from disciplined timing and the effective use of geography. The shallow waters, the hidden shoals, and the narrow coastal approaches would all be weapons in their hands. As the Greeks advanced, the Persian ships attempted to maneuver defensively, spreading out to cover potential landing points for enemy forces. But the Greeks anticipated this. Smaller, more agile ships moved first, striking isolated triremes, ramming them with deadly precision before retreating to avoid counterattacks. Each impact was catastrophic. Bronze met timber with a sound like tearing metal, planks splintered, hulls gaped open, and the sea quickly became a graveyard. Men who had survived the initial chaos of Salamis now faced the same mortal dangers, their screams echoing above the lapping waves. Those who could escape the initial strikes often found themselves trapped by the currents or dashed against hidden reefs along the coastline. Boarding engagements defined the latter stages of the battle. Greek marines, armed with spears, swords, and shields, leapt from their ships onto Persian decks, clashing with defenders in a melee that left little room for error. Every motion mattered. A misstep could mean plunging into the water below or being struck by a spear. The rhythm of oars beneath them maintained the stability of the trireme, a crucial factor as soldiers fought for control of each vessel. The Greeks' coordination, drilled to perfection over countless practice runs and battles, allowed them to overwhelm the enemy ship by ship. The Persian fleet, lacking the same level of cohesion and suffering from the shock of repeated losses, could not mount a sustained counterattack. Tactics at Mycale highlighted the evolution of naval warfare. The Greeks demonstrated the combination of maneuverability, precision strikes, and psychological pressure. Their attacks were not simply brute force. They were designed to induce panic. The Persian crews, already shaken by the loss at Salamis, were vulnerable to confusion and fear. The Greeks exploited this, attacking flanks, isolating ships, and creating chaos that spread rapidly across the Persian lines. By the time the final engagement occurred near the coast, the Persian fleet was effectively neutralized as a fighting force. Hundreds of ships had been destroyed or captured, and thousands of men were killed or forced into surrender. Yet the victory at Mycale was not without its challenges. The Mediterranean's nature tested even the most disciplined fleet. Sudden squalls threatened to capsize small vessels. Shallow reefs tore through the bottoms of unsuspecting triremes. Even the Greeks, masters of coordination, had to constantly adjust to wind shifts and current changes. Every maneuver required split-second timing. A slight miscalculation could turn a successful boarding into disaster, or a ramming attack into a collision with allies. The sea itself was an ever-present adversary, punishing errors as harshly as any enemy blade. The human element was paramount. Rowers labored beneath decks, muscles burning, air thick and heavy, driven by the shouting of captains above. Marines fought atop slippery decks, balancing between stability and aggression. Commanders risked their lives to direct movements, signaling across the water with flags, horns, and gestures. Exhaustion and fear were constants, yet cohesion and morale were what distinguished the Greeks from their adversaries. Discipline under such pressure is not born of obedience alone, but of experience, trust, and an acute understanding of the sea as both ally and threat. The aftermath of Mycale solidified Greek dominance in the Aegean. Unlike Salamis, which was defensive, this was an offensive assertion of control over the sea, demonstrating that Greek fleets could pursue, strike, and annihilate enemy forces even when operating far from home harbors. Strategically, the battle ended organized Persian naval threats in the region. More broadly, it illustrated a principle that would define Mediterranean naval warfare for centuries. Mastery of the sea requires more than firepower. It demands discipline, coordination, tactical innovation, and intimate knowledge of maritime geography. The battle also revealed the psychological dimension of naval warfare. Surviving crews of the Persian fleet were demoralized, understanding that defeat was not a single event, but an inevitability enforced by the Greeks' mastery of the medium. In naval combat, as at Mycale, victory is as much about breaking the enemy's will as sinking their ships. Commanders understood that panic spreads faster than cannon fire, that confusion can turn a superior fleet into a disorganized mass, and that morale is a weapon as deadly as any bronze, ram, or spear. From a technological perspective, the trireme again proved its superiority. Designed for speed, agility, and boarding warfare, it allowed the Greeks to outmaneuver a larger, less disciplined force. The battle emphasized coordinated oar power, effective use of bronze rams, and integration of marines for boarding actions. Tactical innovation, rather than raw numbers, was decisive, a lesson that would echo through centuries of Mediterranean naval engagements. Finally, Mycale demonstrates the enduring lesson of the Mediterranean. The sea is an equalizer. Geography, currents, and weather impose limits on even the largest fleets. The skill, courage, and discipline of the men on board are what determine outcomes. Ships are tools, but they are useless without competent crews and capable commanders. Every decision, from when to ram an enemy vessel to how to angle a ship against a shifting current, carries life or death consequences. For the Greeks, the lessons of Salamis were applied offensively, converting a defensive victory into a decisive strategic dominance across the Aegean waters. As the Greek fleet returned from Mycale, the horizon was littered with the wreckage of Persian ships, a testament to the lethal combination of strategy, skill, and intimate knowledge of the sea. Waves carried broken timbers, bronze rams, and the remnants of thousands of men. Yet the Greeks pressed forward, not only to secure victory, but to assert that the Mediterranean, while deadly, could be mastered. Control of the waters was power, and power was survival. This principle would shape naval warfare across the Mediterranean for millennia. The sea rewards the disciplined, punishes the complacent, and remains an ever-present arbiter of life, death, and empire. The sea can be merciless, and at Aegospotami it became the instrument of total annihilation. The Peloponnesian War, a decades-long conflict between Athens and Sparta, had left the Athenian Empire exhausted, stretched thin across its maritime holdings, and reliant on its fleet as the lifeblood of survival. Athens was not a landlocked power. It was a city of sailors, merchants, and rowers. Its strength lay in the ability to control the waves, to project influence across the Aegean, and to supply distant colonies. Yet, at Aegospotami, the very sea that had empowered Athens became the stage of its final humiliation, the waters itself turning traitor to an empire that had long taken mastery of it for granted. The Peloponnesian fleet, led by the Spartan general Lysander, was smaller in number than the Athenian armada, but possessed something far more potent: discipline, strategic cunning, and an acute understanding of the dynamics of naval warfare in narrow straits and exposed harbors. The Athenians, confident in their numerical superiority, established a base at Aegospotami along the Hellespont, intending to blockade Spartan supplies and force a decisive engagement. Their ships were drawn up along the shore, rowers resting, marines aboard, while the officers assumed the sea itself was a passive element. This complacency would prove fatal. The morning of the disaster was deceptively calm. Gentle winds stirred the surface of the strait, reflecting the early light. From the shore, it appeared as though the Athenian fleet had control, their triremes glinting, their rowers idle but ready. But naval warfare is never passive. Every wave, current, and wind shift can transform safety into peril. The Spartans, observing from across the strait, recognized the vulnerabilities of the stationary Athenian ships. Rowers unpracticed from extended idleness, crews fatigued from prior patrols, and a lack of alertness created openings that could, and would, be exploited with devastating effect. Lysander's strategy was simple yet merciless: patience and precision. The Spartan fleet did not immediately engage. They waited for the moment when Athenian discipline would falter, when the natural tendency of men to grow lax would expose critical weaknesses. At dawn, when only a fraction of the Athenian fleet had been deployed to patrol the waters, the Spartans advanced. Their triremes, smaller and faster than many expected, approached silently, using the morning haze and knowledge of the currents to conceal movement. Rowers strained in near-perfect synchronization, the hulls cutting through the water like blades. Above deck, marines held spears and shields, ready for the sudden, lethal boarding that would come. The first clashes were brutal and immediate. Athenian ships, caught off guard, could not form cohesive formations. Ramming maneuvers became deadly, not just because of Spartan skill, but because the Athenians were positioned poorly, many vessels tethered to the shore or loosely grouped. Bronze rams shattered hulls, splintering timber, and plunging crews into frigid water. Rowers, exhausted and unprepared, struggled to regain control, often contributing to collisions between allied ships. Those who attempted to abandon ship faced the merciless currents of the Hellespont, the chaos of wooden debris, and the Spartan marines moving from ship to ship, killing or capturing all they could. Boarding actions followed swiftly. Spartan marines, disciplined and trained, leapt across decks with deadly precision, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with Athenians who were unready and disorganized. Spear struck shield, sword clashed with bronze, and the narrow decks became confined killing zones. Panic spread rapidly among the Athenians, amplifying the chaos. Unlike Salamis or Mycale, where Greek fleets had imposed order and exploited tactical advantages, the Athenians now faced the terrifying consequences of disunity and complacency. Their numbers, previously an asset, became a liability, creating confusion and blocking escape routes on the water. The geography of the Hellespont intensified the catastrophe. The strait's narrow channels meant that once a ship was attacked, it had few avenues for retreat. Currents pulled vessels into collision with neighbors, shoals trapped the unwary, and rocks tore into hulls. The Spartans exploited these hazards fully, forcing Athenian triremes into positions where their rams were ineffective, their maneuverability limited, and their crews exposed. The sea itself became a weapon in Spartan hands, transforming natural obstacles into strategic advantages. By the time the sun was high, the Athenian fleet was effectively destroyed. Over 100 ships were lost, thousands of rowers and marines perished, and the survivors were few, fleeing inland or captured by the Spartans. The human element of aegospotamy illustrates the brutal reality of naval warfare in the Mediterranean. Rowers beneath decks experienced exhaustion and terror simultaneously, muscles strained to maintain speed as their comrades fought or drowned above. Marines fought in near-total chaos, balancing precariously on wet, rocking decks while facing disciplined opponents. Commanders risked exposure to direct attacks, to direct fleet movements, signaling orders that often came too late or were ignored in panic. The sea, indifferent to human ambition, amplified every error, every lapse in concentration, punishing the overconfident and the complacent. Tactically, the battle emphasizes the importance of timing and discipline. The Spartans waited for the precise moment when the Athenian fleet was vulnerable, striking with devastating efficiency. Their triremes, though fewer, were coordinated to exploit every weakness. Ramming, boarding, and tactical use of the currents allowed them to destroy a superior force entirely at sea. The Athenian collapse was not due solely to Spartan skill. It was also the result of human error, overconfidence, and failure to respect the unpredictable nature of the maritime environment. Aegospotamy also demonstrates the evolution of Greek naval warfare. The trireme, perfected over decades of conflict, was a machine optimized for precision, speed, and coordinated strikes. Bronze rams, 3 banks of oars, and trained marines provided offensive and defensive capabilities that could overwhelm the unprepared. Yet even such advanced ships required disciplined crews. Without alertness and cohesion, the very vessels that had made Athens formidable became death traps. At Aegospotamy, this principle was brutally reaffirmed. The Mediterranean is a realm where human preparation, discipline, and understanding of the sea dictate life and death. The consequences were immediate and profound. Athens, once dominant in the Aegean, was left vulnerable and broken. Supply lines were severed, colonies lost access to essential support, and morale throughout the city-state plummeted. Naval dominance, which had sustained the Athenian Empire, was no longer attainable. Sparta, having demonstrated mastery not through sheer numbers, but through discipline, timing, and environmental awareness, assumed control of the maritime theater. The battle underscored a universal truth of the Mediterranean. Control of the sea is not granted by fleet size or wealth, but by strategy, skill, and command over both men and waves. The psychological impact on surviving Athenians was devastating. Sailors and marines who survived the initial onslaught faced exposure, starvation, and the threat of capture. The sea, once a familiar friend, had transformed into a relentless adversary. Panic, despair, and the sheer scale of loss ensured that morale would never recover quickly. Meanwhile, Spartan crews, disciplined and coordinated, emerged relatively unscathed, demonstrating that in naval warfare, preparation and unity are often more decisive than courage alone. From a strategic perspective, Aegospotami altered the trajectory of the Peloponnesian War irreversibly. With Athens' fleet destroyed, the city-state could no longer contest control of the Aegean or protect its far-flung holdings. Sparta's maritime dominance allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement, severing supply lines and imposing blockades. The battle, fought entirely at sea, exemplified the lethal efficiency of disciplined forces exploiting geography, timing, and coordination. It remains a case study in how naval supremacy can determine the fate of empires. Technologically, the trireme again proved both its strength and its vulnerability. Optimized for ramming, speed, and coordination, it excelled under well-trained crews. But the events at Aegospotami illustrated a key limitation. Without alert and disciplined rowers and marines, the trireme's advantages could be nullified, turning it into a floating trap. The battle reinforced the principle that mastery of naval warfare in the Mediterranean relies as much on human skill and organization as it does on ship design or firepower. Aegospotami stands as one of the most consequential sea battles of antiquity. Unlike Salamis, which saved Greek independence, or Mycale, which demonstrated offensive Greek naval capability, this engagement represented the total destruction of a dominant maritime power by superior discipline and strategy. It also demonstrates the unforgiving nature of the Mediterranean. A single lapse in vigilance, a momentary misjudgment, or overconfidence can turn the sea from ally to executioner. As the waters of the Hellespont ran with wreckage, floating timbers, and the remnants of thousands of men, the lesson was clear. Control of the Mediterranean was never permanent. The sea rewarded preparation, coordination, and strategic brilliance, while punishing hubris, complacency, and over-reliance on numbers. The Athenian fleet, once the pride of the Greek world, had been undone entirely at sea, leaving a stark reminder that the Mediterranean is a realm where life and death are decided not by land fortifications or city walls, but by the rhythm of oars, the angle of bronze rams, and the courage of men facing the merciless waves. Aegospotami, brutal, precise, and total, echoes across history as a testament to the lethal dynamics of naval warfare. Every subsequent engagement in the Mediterranean, from triremes to galleys to cannon-laden ships, would build upon the lessons learned here. Discipline, coordination, understanding of the sea, and mastery of timing are the ultimate determinants of success or failure. The battle reaffirms that, in the Mediterranean, the sea is not merely a medium for transport. It is a decisive battlefield, an arbiter of empires, and a crucible of human courage, skill, and endurance. The Mediterranean is a realm where size alone does not dictate victory, yet at Cape Ecnomus, the sheer scale of human ambition collided with the immensity of the sea. It was 256 BC, during the First Punic War, and Rome had decided to challenge Carthage for control of the Mediterranean, launching an audacious invasion of North Africa. The stakes were unprecedented. two great powers, each with massive fleets and armies, were about to clash in waters that would witness the largest naval engagement the ancient world had ever seen. Over 600 ships would maneuver, ram, and board in a deadly ballet where a single misstep could destroy hundreds of lives. The battle was not just a test of weapons or strength, it was a test of discipline, endurance, and mastery of the unforgiving sea. The Roman fleet, newly constructed and inexperienced, faced a formidable Carthaginian armada. Rome had only recently become a naval power. Their experience was primarily terrestrial. To compensate, they employed innovation and sheer audacity. Each ship was a quinquereme, larger than the triremes of previous generations, powered by 5 rows of oars. The human effort required to propel these vessels was immense. Hundreds of rowers per ship bent beneath decks, muscles straining, lungs burning, their coordination essential for survival. Above, marines armed with spears, swords, and shields prepared for boarding actions. The prow of each ship was reinforced with a bronze ram, designed to pierce enemy hulls and turn timber into splinters. These ships were floating fortresses, engines of destruction, and lifelines for the men aboard. The Carthaginian fleet, seasoned and highly skilled, awaited. Their sailors and marines had fought in countless engagements, understanding the rhythm of oars, the timing of rams, and the art of exploiting currents and wind. Theirs was a combination of experience, speed, and cunning. Unlike the Romans, they relied on agility and precise maneuvers rather than brute numbers. This disparity in experience and training meant that the battle would not be won simply by overwhelming force, but by coordination, timing, and the exploitation of every tactical advantage the sea could offer. As the fleets approached each other off the coast of Sicily, the scene was chaotic even before contact. Hundreds of vessels converged, the water churned by oars and hulls, and the sky echoed with the shouts of captains and the horns of command. On board, rowers strained in unison, their bodies a blur of muscle and exertion, synchronized with each beat of the drum-like commands from officers above. The tension was palpable. One misstep could result in collision with an ally, exposure to a Carthaginian ram, or capsizing in the churning Mediterranean. Each ship carried its own microcosm of battle, yet these microcosms were interdependent, forming massive formations whose success or failure would dictate the outcome of the entire engagement. The Romans employed an innovative tactic, the double-line formation. The lead line engaged directly, absorbing initial Carthaginian maneuvers and drawing their attention, while the second line flanked the enemy, ready to strike exposed sides. Quinqueremes collided with Carthaginian triremes and heavier vessels, bronze rams smashing into hulls, splintering wood, and sending men into the sea. Above deck, marines surged across gaps between ships, engaging in close-quarters combat that was as brutal as any land battle. The coordination required to maintain formations, execute ramming attacks, and board simultaneously was staggering. Ships could not slow or turn easily without disrupting the entire formation. Every order had to be perfectly timed. The Carthaginians responded with agility, attempting to exploit gaps in Roman formations. Their ships darted between Quinqueremes, attempting to isolate vessels and overwhelm crews before reinforcements could arrive. Ramming attacks tore through less disciplined ships, and boarding parties engaged in ferocious fights on decks that were slick with water, blood, and oil from burned planks. Panic spread quickly where cohesion faltered, yet the Romans, through discipline, perseverance, and innovative tactics, managed to hold the line, turning the engagement into a brutal test of endurance. Geography and environmental conditions were decisive. The battle took place near Cape Ecnomus, a region of currents, shoals, and variable winds. Commanders had to account for these natural factors while simultaneously directing hundreds of vessels and thousands of men. Currents could slow a ship, redirect it into danger, or throw off a ramming attack. Shoals threatened to breach hulls, while sudden gusts of wind could push ships into collision or overturn them. The Mediterranean itself was an ever-present adversary, a force that punished mistakes and rewarded foresight and skill. The human cost of the battle was extraordinary. Thousands of rowers endured near constant exertion, their lives dependent on the rhythm of coordinated oars. Marines fought atop unstable decks, balancing between attacking the enemy and avoiding plunging into the sea. Officers exposed themselves to enemy fire to maintain control of formations, signaling through horns, flags, and shouted commands. Ships became islands of violence and chaos, each carrying the lives of hundreds, their fates intertwined with the success of the formation and the decisions of commanders hundreds of meters away. Ramming tactics dominated the initial phases of the engagement. Roman Quinqueremes, despite inexperience, smashed into Carthaginian hulls, piercing timbers and sending crews into the water. The bronze rams, designed to strike at the waterline, often breached the hull entirely. Ships that survived initial impacts were immediately vulnerable to boarding, as Marines poured across the decks, engaging in lethal hand-to-hand combat. The sea became littered with splintered wood, floating shields, and bodies, a grisly testament to the ferocity of the encounter. Boarding engagements were decisive. The Romans had introduced a modification known as the Corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Marines to cross directly onto enemy vessels. This innovation turned sea combat into an extension of land warfare, where disciplined infantry tactics could be applied atop the unstable decks of Quinqueremes. Marines swung shields, thrust spears, and grappled with opponents while rowers continued their relentless effort below. The chaos was total, yet it was organized chaos, where discipline, timing, and coordination determined survival. As the battle raged, environmental hazards intensified. Waves broke over decks, threatening to wash away Marines. Ships collided unexpectedly, creating crushing accidents that killed both attackers and defenders. Rowers who faltered under exhaustion could compromise an entire formation. The Mediterranean, a medium of life and death, amplified every error. Commanders who failed to anticipate wind shifts or current patterns saw their ships thrown into disorder, while those who mastered the interplay of human and environmental forces turned these dangers into tactical advantages. The outcome was a Roman victory, though costly. Carthage lost a substantial portion of its fleet, and Roman casualties, while lower than anticipated, were significant. Cape Ecnomus demonstrated the lethal combination of scale, innovation, and discipline in naval warfare. It illustrated that even newly trained fleets, when properly commanded and organized, could overcome experienced opponents through superior strategy and technological adaptation. Quinqueremes, corvi, coordinated formations, and disciplined crews transformed raw manpower into an instrument of domination on the waves. Strategically, the battle opened the way for the Roman invasion of North Africa, marking the first time Rome projected power across the Mediterranean in such a decisive way. It also established a template for future naval engagements. The integration of ship design, tactical innovation, environmental mastery, and human endurance. The lessons of Cape Ecnomus would echo through centuries, influencing naval theory and practice across the Mediterranean world. The psychological dimension was as critical as the physical. Carthaginian crews, facing repeated ramming attacks and relentless boarding, experienced fear and disarray. Roman discipline ensured that morale remained intact despite the intensity of the battle. Naval combat is unique in its intimacy with death. The line between life and drowning is measured in meters, and panic can spread faster than any weapon. Victory at Cape Ecnomus was achieved not through mere courage, but through training, cohesion, and mastery of both men and the sea. The human drama extends beyond the battle itself. Thousands of rowers, marines, and officers faced the relentless strain of hours of combat. Exhaustion, injuries, and exposure threatened every life. Yet every individual played a role in the outcome. The success of one ship could influence the fate of dozens. The skill of a single captain could determine the survival of hundreds. The Mediterranean does not forgive mistakes, and Cape Ecnomus illustrates how human endurance, courage, and tactical insight must coexist to achieve dominance at sea. Cape Ecnomus remains unparalleled in scale and ambition. Over 600 ships, tens of thousands of men, and countless tons of timber, bronze, and human effort collided in a single engagement. The battle demonstrates the Mediterranean's dual nature, a medium that sustains civilizations, and a stage for their annihilation. Rome, through innovation and discipline, transformed potential inexperience into overwhelming effectiveness, showing that, even in the largest naval battles, mastery of the sea, timing, and coordination can triumph over raw skill and familiarity. In retrospect, Cape Ecnomus was more than a battle. It was a turning point in Mediterranean naval history. It established Rome as a maritime power, showcased technological and tactical innovation, and highlighted the interplay of human skill and environmental mastery. The Mediterranean, vast and unpredictable, had claimed its victims, but also allowed the disciplined to rise. Quinqueremes, corvi, bronze rams, and the sweat and courage of rowers created a symphony of destruction, teaching a lesson that every commander would remember. On the Mediterranean, the sea is both ally and executioner, and mastery of it is the ultimate determinant of power. The Mediterranean had long been a theater of blood timber and bronze, a place where the rise and fall of empires was dictated not by walls or fortresses, but by the mastery of men on oars, the angle of bronze rams, and the courage of marines clashing on unstable decks. By 260 BC, Rome had decided that control of Sicily and dominance over the western Mediterranean could only be achieved at sea. Yet Rome's naval experience was limited. For centuries, it had been a land power, its soldiers trained to fight on solid ground, its tactics grounded in phalanx formations and disciplined infantry. The Carthaginians, in contrast, had built a maritime empire, their sailors and marines seasoned in every type of naval engagement, from narrow straits to open seas. Mylae would become the crucible in which Rome transformed from a tentative seafaring power into a true naval force. The Roman fleet, numbering nearly 120 Quinqueremes, was assembled along the coast of Italy. These ships were massive, built to accommodate hundreds of rowers working in synchronization across 5 banks of oars. Rowers, often drawn from citizen levies rather than professional sailors, had trained under the relentless supervision of Roman commanders to maintain perfect coordination. Above, hundreds of marines armed with spears, swords, and shields stood ready, balancing precariously on the slippery decks. At the prow, the bronze rams glinted, designed to strike at enemy hulls with lethal precision. Yet, for all their size and raw manpower, the Romans knew they could not defeat the Carthaginians with traditional tactics alone. They would need innovation. This innovation came in the form of the Corvus, a boarding bridge measuring roughly 1.2 meters wide and 11 meters long, equipped with a heavy spike at the end. The Corvus allowed Roman marines to bridge the gap between ships, turning naval combat into an extension of their formidable land-based combat style. With the Corvus, Romans could latch onto enemy vessels and deploy trained infantry to overwhelm sailors and marines in hand-to-hand combat. In essence, the Corvus neutralized Carthaginian experience at sea, forcing engagements into a realm where Roman discipline and infantry expertise dominated. The Carthaginian fleet, approximately 130 ships strong, approached with confidence. Their crews had weathered countless battles, and their ships were manned by skilled sailors who understood the subtleties of Mediterranean currents, wind shifts, and tactical maneuvering. They expected a traditional naval engagement in which speed, ramming, and agility would determine the outcome. They had no experience with the Corvus, and they underestimated the audacity and adaptability of the Roman commanders. The battle began under the harsh morning sun, the waters between Mylae and the northern Sicilian coast calm but deceptive. Hundreds of oars cut through the Aegean-like waves with rhythm, the sound of human effort resonating across the sea. The Roman fleet advanced in tight formations, designed to protect individual ships from flanking maneuvers and to ensure that corvée could be deployed effectively. Carthaginian triremes and quadriremes moved to intercept, relying on speed to ram and destabilize the heavier Roman quinqueremes. The initial clashes were brutal. Bronze rams tore into hulls, sending timber and men into the water. Rowers strained under exhaustion, maintaining both speed and direction, while their comrades above fought desperately to keep ships aligned. When the Corvus was deployed, the dynamic of battle shifted dramatically. Roman marines leapt across, their shields interlocked, spears thrust with disciplined precision. The decks of Carthaginian ships became scenes of brutal close-quarters combat. Men grappling in confined spaces, shields clashing, spears stabbing, and the occasional plunge into the sea for those overpowered or disoriented. The Carthaginians, trained for maneuver-based combat rather than infantry-style engagement aboard decks, struggled to repel the Roman advance. Ships that had relied on agility to evade rams now found themselves immobilized, their hulls locked to Roman vessels as their crews were overwhelmed. Rowers beneath decks were as critical to the outcome as the marines above. Maintaining synchronization under the chaos of boarding and ramming required extraordinary endurance and focus. A single misalignment could cause a ship to drift into dangerous waters, collide with allies, or fail to maintain momentum for an attack. Fatigue was relentless. The human body was stretched to its limits as rowers fought not only the sea and enemy attacks, but also the physical strain of hours of exertion. Every stroke mattered. Every movement could mean survival or death. The Carthaginian response was fierce but ineffective. They attempted evasive maneuvers, trying to outflank Roman vessels and isolate individual ships. However, the Corvus nullified these efforts. Once engaged, the Roman superior infantry training ensured that boarding parties dominated the decks. Spear met shield in the violent choreography of battle, while timbers splintered and the sea claimed those who fell. Panic began to spread among Carthaginian crews, and cohesion faltered. Isolated ships were captured one after another, the Roman advance relentless and precise. Geography played a subtle but critical role. The coastline near Mylae allowed the Romans to maintain formations, protect flanks, and control approaches. Shallow waters prevented Carthaginian escape in some directions, while narrow coastal gaps concentrated engagements where Roman coordination could dominate. Currents and wind shifts threatened both fleets, but Roman discipline allowed them to adjust and capitalize on natural forces. The Mediterranean itself became an ally, amplifying the advantage of preparation and coordination while punishing miscalculation and panic. By the end of the day, the result was unmistakable. The Romans had secured their first major naval victory. They captured dozens of Carthaginian ships, sank many others, and inflicted heavy casualties. The psychological impact was as significant as the material loss. The Carthaginians, previously confident in their maritime superiority, were forced to reconsider the power of Roman innovation and discipline. Rome had transformed from a land-based power into a maritime force, capable of projecting influence across the Mediterranean, the battle also demonstrated the importance of adaptation in naval warfare. Traditional ramming tactics and maneuver-based combat had dominated for centuries, but Rome's introduction of the Corvus changed the equation. By turning naval engagements into extensions of land combat, Rome neutralized the enemy's experience and expertise at sea. Mylae became a precedent for future battles, highlighting that innovation, training, and adaptability could overcome numerical or experiential disadvantages. The human cost was profound. Hundreds of men were killed in boarding actions, crushed beneath falling masts, or swept into the waves. The relentless physical and mental strain of combat pushed rowers and marines to their limits. Commanders had to maintain order under extreme conditions, ensuring that formations held and morale remained intact. Every individual's actions, from the skill of a rower to the courage of a marine in close combat, contributed to the overall outcome. The sea, indifferent and unforgiving, was as much a participant in the battle as any soldier or ship. Strategically, Mylae set the stage for Rome's maritime expansion. Control of the Tyrrhenian and western Mediterranean seas allowed Rome to secure supply lines, threaten Carthaginian holdings, and project power across Sicily and beyond. The battle underscored a fundamental principle of Mediterranean naval warfare. Victory is determined by a combination of technology, human skill, discipline, and mastery of the environment. Ships alone, regardless of size or number, are insufficient without well-trained crews and tactical innovation. In retrospect, Mylae is more than a military engagement. It is a turning point in the history of naval warfare. It demonstrates how innovation can compensate for inexperience, how discipline can outweigh tradition, and how human skill can dominate even the most unpredictable of environments. The Mediterranean, vast and merciless, had claimed many victims over the centuries, yet it also rewarded ingenuity, courage, and preparation. At Mylae, Rome earned its first claim to maritime power, proving that even a land-focused empire could learn to dominate the waves. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate victory. The Corvus would be used in subsequent engagements throughout the First Punic War, shaping Roman naval doctrine. The lessons learned on the importance of boarding, coordination, and the integration of infantry tactics at sea would inform naval strategy for decades. More broadly, Mylae demonstrates the enduring dynamics of Mediterranean naval warfare. The interplay of technology, geography, human endurance, and tactical innovation in a domain where mistakes are fatal and mastery is rewarded with dominance. At the end of the battle, the waters near Mylae were littered with wreckage, broken timbers, shattered shields, and the bodies of those who had fallen in the violent struggle. Rowers and marines alike had experienced the full brutality of naval combat, their lives dependent on coordination, courage, and the relentless rhythm of oars. The sea, silent and vast, once the battle concluded, bore witness to the transformation of Rome from an untested maritime power into a force capable of challenging even the most experienced fleets. Mylae stands as a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and the lethal choreography of naval warfare. It shows that even in the most violent and chaotic encounters, discipline, preparation, and innovation can tip the scales. The battle also reminds us that the Mediterranean, though beautiful and serene at times, has always been a theater of mortality, a place where the ambitions of men, the skill of crews, and the power of the sea collide in a deadly dance. For Rome, Mylae was not merely a victory. It was the birth of a naval tradition that would shape the course of Mediterranean history for centuries to come. The Mediterranean is a merciless arena, a domain where timber, bronze, and human endurance collide in a ceaseless contest for survival and supremacy. By 255 BC, Rome had not only asserted itself on land, but had begun to dominate the sea in its protracted struggle with Carthage during the First Punic War. The Romans had already secured a major victory at Mylae 5 years prior, using the revolutionary Corvus boarding device to neutralize Carthaginian naval experience. Yet the Carthaginians were resilient, rebuilding fleets, retraining crews, and refining their tactics. The clash at Cape Hermaeum would test Rome's mastery of the sea in ways both strategic and brutal, pushing men, ships, and commanders to the limits. The Roman fleet, numbering over 350 Quinqueremes, sailed from the southern coast of Italy towards Sicily, tasked with securing control over key maritime routes and ensuring the safe transport of supplies to Roman forces on the island. These ships were massive instruments of war, each with hundreds of rowers working in perfect synchronization across 5 banks of oars. Above decks, marines stood ready, their shields and spears poised for boarding, aware that the Mediterranean was both battlefield and executioner. At the prow, bronze rams glimmered in the sunlight, designed to puncture hulls, shatter formations, and turn timber into lethal projectiles. Every crew member understood that survival depended on discipline, coordination, and unflinching courage. The Carthaginian fleet, slightly smaller but highly experienced, awaited near the Strait of Sicily. Their sailors had been tested in countless engagements and were adept at maneuvering, ramming, and using the currents and winds of the Mediterranean to their advantage. Unlike the Romans, whose strength lay in innovation and the integration of land-based tactics at sea, Carthaginian crews relied on speed, agility, and centuries of maritime expertise. They were confident that their experience would carry them to victory. Yet Rome had learned quickly, adapting its fleets, refining the Corvus, and training crews to endure long hours of combat under the most grueling conditions. The battle began in the early morning, the sea deceptively calm under the rising sun. Hundreds of oars cut through the water in a rhythmic cadence, the collective effort of rowers beneath decks resonating across the strait. Roman commanders arranged their ships in a broad line formation, designed to absorb initial attacks while allowing for the effective deployment of the Corvus. The Carthaginians attempted their classic maneuver tactics, aiming to isolate Roman vessels, strike flanks, and ram the more cumbersome Quinqueremes. The initial collisions were catastrophic. Bronze rams struck hulls with devastating force, sending wood, splinters, and men into the waves. Rowers struggled to maintain coordination, battling both exhaustion and the sudden shifts in ship positioning caused by impacts. The Corvus once again proved decisive. Roman marines swung across the boarding bridges with disciplined precision, their shields interlocked, spears thrust forward, and swords clashing with Carthaginian defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Ships that had relied on speed and maneuvering found themselves immobilized, their decks transformed into deadly arenas where Roman infantry tactics dominated. The sea, indifferent yet unforgiving, claimed those who fell from decks, while survivors fought on amid chaos, splintered wood, and churning waters. Geography was as much a weapon as any human hand. The Strait of Sicily, narrow in places and subject to shifting currents, amplified the advantages of Roman coordination. Captains calculated angles to exploit currents, avoid shoals, and maximize the effectiveness of ramming attacks. Carthaginian ships attempting to maneuver at high speed risked being pushed into shallow waters or isolated from reinforcements. Commanders on both sides had to factor wind, wave, and tidal movement into every tactical decision, knowing that even a single misjudgment could result in catastrophe. The human dimension of the battle was relentless. Rowers labored beneath decks for hours, muscles burning, lungs heaving, every stroke synchronized to maintain formation and momentum. Above, marines fought atop swaying decks, balancing between attacking enemies and avoiding the deadly waves beneath. Officers exposed themselves to enemy fire, shouting commands to maintain cohesion across hundreds of ships. Panic could spread in an instant. One ship losing control could create a domino effect, imperiling entire formations. Discipline, training, and mutual trust were as critical to survival as bronze rams or corvi. Ramming engagements continued throughout the day. Roman Quinqueremes collided with Carthaginian vessels, piercing hulls and incapacitating ships before marines even boarded. Bronze rams splintered timber, sank ships, and created obstacles in the water that disrupted enemy maneuvers. Boarding actions followed, marines pouring across decks, shields clashing, spears thrust, and swords slicing through armor. Those unable to resist the tide of disciplined Roman infantry were thrown into the water, swallowed by the unforgiving Mediterranean. The Carthaginians attempted counterattacks, using speed and tactical maneuvering to isolate Roman ships. Yet, the Romans' rigorous training, superior numbers, and effective use of the Corvus allowed them to maintain cohesion. They adapted mid-battle, using damaged ships to block flanks, repositioning boarding parties, and ensuring that each engagement contributed to the larger strategy. The sea itself, often a chaotic and unpredictable force, became a medium through which Roman discipline transformed into lethal power. By evening, the Roman victory was unmistakable. The Carthaginian fleet suffered heavy losses, with dozens of ships sunk or captured. Casualties were immense. Thousands of sailors and marines were killed, injured, or lost at sea. The Romans, while victorious, paid their own heavy toll in men and damaged vessels, illustrating the brutal equilibrium of Mediterranean naval warfare. Every engagement demanded the maximum from humans and ships alike, and survival depended on skill, coordination, and relentless determination. Strategically, Cape Hermaeum reinforced Rome's maritime supremacy. Control of the Strait of Sicily secured crucial supply lines, allowed reinforcement of Sicilian garrisons, and projected power into Carthaginian territory. It demonstrated the effectiveness of combining innovation, disciplined crews, and tactical flexibility in overcoming an experienced adversary. The Corvus, refined through repeated use, had turned naval combat into an extension of Roman military doctrine, allowing land-based infantry strategies to dominate on the open sea. The battle also underscored a fundamental truth of Mediterranean naval warfare. Human skill, coordination, and environmental mastery determine outcomes more decisively than ship size or numbers alone. A single miscalculation could doom hundreds of men. A single lapse in vigilance could unravel formations, and a single storm or rogue current could tip the balance between victory and disaster. The Mediterranean, with its unpredictable winds, currents, and tides, was as much an adversary as the opposing fleet, enforcing discipline and punishing error with brutal efficiency. The psychological toll of the battle was immense. Surviving crews endured not only physical exhaustion, but also the trauma of witnessing comrades hurled into the sea, the splintering of ships, and the overwhelming violence of boarding actions. Fear, courage, and endurance interacted in a deadly calculus, where panic could mean instant death, and steadfastness could yield survival and victory. Commanders maintained morale with an iron hand, knowing that cohesion was the only path to victory in the chaos of massive naval engagements. Cape Hermaeum's legacy lies in its demonstration of Roman naval evolution, from untested seafarers to disciplined fleets capable of defeating experienced adversaries. Rome had transformed the dynamics of Mediterranean warfare. The battle illustrated that technological innovation, disciplined manpower, and tactical ingenuity could overcome centuries of maritime experience. Quinqueremes, corvi, bronze rams, and trained marines combined to create a new paradigm in naval conflict, one where discipline, coordination, and strategic use of the environment determined supremacy. As the sun set over the strait, the waters of Cape Hermaeum were littered with wreckage, debris, and the remnants of thousands of men. Ships, splintered and shattered, floated amidst the bloodied waves. The battle, violent, chaotic, and decisive, reinforced the Mediterranean's dual nature, a source of life and commerce, but also an arena of death and relentless challenge. For Rome, the victory solidified maritime dominance, proving that the lessons of Mylae had been internalized and that Roman crews could now face any opponent at sea with confidence. Cape Hermaeum stands as a testament to endurance, skill, and the lethal beauty of Mediterranean naval warfare. It demonstrates that mastery of the sea demands more than ships. It requires innovation, preparation, discipline, and the ability to exploit both natural and human factors. In the unforgiving waters between Sicily and North Africa, Rome had proven itself capable of projecting power, adapting to adversity, and imposing its will upon the Mediterranean, establishing principles that would guide naval strategy for centuries to come. The Mediterranean, vast and merciless, is a stage where ambition, discipline, and courage collide. By 241 BC, Rome and Carthage had been locked in the First Punic War for over 2 decades, a conflict defined not by grand land sieges alone, but by the relentless contest for mastery of the waves. The war had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, destroyed countless ships, and turned the waters between Sicily and North Africa into a theater of continuous bloodshed. Yet, the final act had yet to be played. At the Aegates Islands, a decisive confrontation would determine who would control the western Mediterranean for generations. Rome had learned much since the early defeats of its fledgling navy. Quinqueremes had become standard, rowers trained to exhaustion, and marines practiced in the lethal choreography of boarding. The Corvus boarding device, initially introduced at Mylae, had been refined and adapted for the mass engagements that defined Mediterranean warfare. Each Roman ship was not merely a vessel, it was a floating fortress, an instrument of coordinated violence, and a testament to human endurance and innovation. Above decks, hundreds of marines stood ready, their shields polished, spears sharpened, and hearts steeled for the chaos that would unfold. Below, rowers strained against the unyielding resistance of the sea, muscles burning, lungs heaving, synchronizing each stroke with life or death precision. The Carthaginian fleet, nearly 250 ships strong, had been hastily rebuilt after previous defeats. Their crews, though less experienced than Rome's at this point, were seasoned sailors familiar with the currents, tides, and shoals surrounding the Aegates Islands. They hoped to leverage speed, maneuverability, and superior knowledge of the waters to outflank and destroy the Roman armada. Confidence, however, is a dangerous companion in naval warfare. Overconfidence, poor preparation, and underestimation of an opponent's discipline can turn the sea from ally to executioner. The Carthaginians would soon learn this truth in the most brutal fashion. The stage was set in early March, when calm seas and favorable winds allowed Rome to deploy its fleet efficiently. The Roman commanders, aware that Carthage relied heavily on speed and maneuvering, positioned their ships in disciplined lines, designed to absorb initial attacks while allowing the Corvus to be deployed decisively. Rowers, often citizens conscripted for the purpose, had been drilled relentlessly to maintain both formation and speed. Marines prepared for close-quarters combat, while officers calculated currents, wind patterns, and angles of approach with meticulous care. Every element, from human skill to environmental conditions, was integrated into a strategy designed to leave nothing to chance. When the fleets first sighted each other, the tension was palpable. Hundreds of oars cut through the turquoise waters, hulls glinting in the sunlight. bronze rams poised for destruction. The Carthaginians moved with intent, confident that their experience and agility would allow them to strike first and escape unscathed. The Romans held steady, disciplined in formation, relying on training, coordination, and the lethal potential of the Corvus. The sea, calm yet unpredictable, bore witness to the approaching storm of violence. The battle commenced with ramming and maneuvering. Carthaginian ships sought to isolate Roman vessels, aiming for the sides and sterns of Quinqueremes. Bronze rams pierced hulls, shattering timber and sending sailors into the churning waves. Rowers strained to maintain course and speed, balancing against both physical exhaustion and the instability caused by impacts. Above deck, Marines readied themselves for boarding, aware that each encounter could mean death or the capture of enemy ships. The Mediterranean, a medium of both life and death, amplified every error, rewarded discipline, and punished hesitation. As the engagement intensified, the Corvus was deployed with devastating effectiveness. Roman Marines surged across boarding bridges, shields locking, spears thrust, and swords swinging in lethal arcs. Carthaginian crews, trained for maneuver-based combat rather than infantry-style engagement atop decks, were quickly overwhelmed. Ships that relied on speed were immobilized, turning their decks into deadly arenas where Roman discipline and training dominated. Panic spread rapidly among the Carthaginians. Cohesion faltered, and isolated vessels were systematically captured or destroyed. The sea itself became an accomplice to the Roman strategy, amplifying the effectiveness of their disciplined formations while exposing the weaknesses of the enemy. Geography played a subtle but critical role. The Aegates Islands, with their shallow waters, hidden reefs, and strong currents, presented hazards to both fleets. Roman commanders had studied the region, positioning ships to exploit these natural obstacles. Carthaginian vessels attempting to maneuver at high speed risked grounding on shoals or colliding with allies. Currents could either aid or hinder attacks, depending on timing and positioning. In naval warfare of the Mediterranean, mastery of the environment was as crucial as mastery of the enemy. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Hundreds of men perished in the chaos of boarding, crushed under fallen masts, or drowned in the unforgiving sea. Rowers endured grueling physical labor, muscles screaming, yet maintained the relentless rhythm required to maneuver the ships. Marines fought on swaying, waterlogged decks, balancing precision and brute strength in hand-to-hand combat. Officers risked exposure to maintain cohesion, issuing commands with flags, horns, and shouted orders, knowing that a single lapse could unravel an entire formation. Every individual action contributed directly to the fate of hundreds, and every mistake could be fatal. The Battle of the Aegates Islands marked a decisive evolution in naval warfare. Rome demonstrated that disciplined crews, innovative tactics, and mastery of both environment and human resources could overwhelm even experienced adversaries. The Corvus, once a novelty, had become a tool of decisive strategy, allowing Roman infantry tactics to dominate in maritime contexts. Ramming, boarding, and precise formation maneuvering were integrated into a cohesive approach that turned raw manpower into an instrument of overwhelming force. Carthaginian losses were catastrophic. Dozens of ships were sunk, hundreds captured, and thousands of sailors killed or taken prisoner. The defeat crippled Carthage's ability to contest Roman dominance at sea, effectively ending its naval power in the western Mediterranean. For the Romans, the victory secured supply lines to Sicily, allowed reinforcement of garrisons, and demonstrated that Rome had become a maritime power capable of challenging even the most experienced fleets. Psychologically, the battle reinforced the supremacy of discipline, preparation, and innovation. Roman crews endured the full chaos of naval warfare, maintaining cohesion under conditions of extreme stress, while Carthaginian morale collapsed under the relentless assault. Panic, once introduced into the enemy ranks, cascaded rapidly, illustrating the fragility of cohesion in naval combat and the deadly consequences of overconfidence or poor preparation. Strategically, the Aegates Islands battle concluded the First Punic War, forcing Carthage to negotiate peace and cede Sicily to Rome. The Mediterranean, which had been a contested space of survival and ambition for centuries, now acknowledged Rome as a dominant maritime power. The battle demonstrated that naval supremacy is not merely a function of experience or numbers, but of innovation, discipline, and environmental mastery. Quinqueremes, corvée, bronze rhombs, and human endurance combined to create a decisive force capable of shaping the geopolitical landscape of the region. The legacy of the battle extends far beyond its immediate consequences. It illustrates the principles of Mediterranean naval warfare, the lethal integration of human skill, technological innovation, strategic insight, and environmental awareness. It shows how a disciplined, innovative force can overcome superior experience or traditional methods. Most importantly, it highlights the unforgiving nature of the sea. A single miscalculation, a momentary lapse in discipline, or a misjudgment of currents and wind can turn the Mediterranean from highway to executioner. As the sun set over the Aegates Islands, the waters bore witness to both destruction and triumph. Ships, splintered and overturned, floated amidst the debris, while thousands of men struggled for survival in the open sea. The battle's aftermath was silent yet profound. The Mediterranean had claimed many lives, but Rome had proven itself capable of mastery, of imposing its will, and of shaping the course of history through naval power alone. Aegates Islands stands as a testament to endurance, skill, and the brutal artistry of naval warfare. It reminds us that the sea, though beautiful and serene at times, has always been a realm of mortality, where human ambition and ingenuity collide with relentless natural forces. For Rome, the victory marked not only the end of a war, but the birth of an enduring maritime tradition that would shape Mediterranean history for centuries to come. The lessons of the battle, discipline, innovation, environmental mastery, and the lethal choreography of human endeavor remain as relevant today as they were over 2 millennia ago, echoing across the waves of history. The Mediterranean, ever capricious, had already witnessed the rise and fall of empires by 214 BC. Its waters, shimmering under the sun, belied a history of violence, ambition, and survival, where timber and bronze, oars and marines dictated the fates of men and nations alike. During the Second Punic War, the struggle between Rome and Carthage had escalated beyond the Italian peninsula, spilling into Sicily and its surrounding waters. Control of the Mediterranean meant control of supply lines, reinforcements, and ultimately victory itself. It was in this theater that the Battle of Cape Agathon would unfold, a brutal encounter combining strategy, deception, and sheer human endurance, reminding all who sailed these waters that the sea rewards preparation and punishes hubris without mercy. Rome, now an established naval power after decades of hard-earned experience in the First Punic War, faced Carthaginian fleets determined to disrupt their maritime dominance. The Roman ships, primarily Quinqueremes, were larger and sturdier than the Carthaginian triremes, designed to carry hundreds of rowers and marines. Each vessel was a floating fortress, engineered to combine speed, durability, and offensive capability. Hundreds of rowers labored beneath decks, muscles taut, hearts pounding, synchronized to maintain the relentless rhythm that ensured propulsion, maneuverability, and combat readiness. Above, marines armed with spears and swords balanced on wet, rocking decks, shields interlocked to form walls of human steel ready to surge across enemy vessels at a moment's notice. Bronze rams, sharpened to deadly perfection, gleamed in the sunlight, their lethal potential matched only by the coordination and discipline of those who controlled them. The Carthaginian fleet, seasoned and motivated, sought to challenge Rome's maritime supremacy and disrupt its operations in Sicily. Their triremes were lighter and faster, optimized for maneuvering and ramming tactics. Carthaginian crews relied on centuries of seafaring experience, confident that their skill and agility would allow them to outmaneuver the heavier Roman vessels and strike decisively. They aimed to isolate Roman ships, strike at flanks, and exploit the terrain and currents of Cape Agathon to their advantage. Yet, Rome had learned from decades of naval combat. Victory required more than ships and skill. It required discipline, coordination, environmental mastery, and the audacity to innovate. The battle commenced under a sky streaked with morning light, the waters deceptively calm. Hundreds of oars sliced through the sea in perfect unison, the collective effort of men forming the beating heart of the fleet. Roman commanders positioned their ships in layered formations designed to absorb initial Carthaginian attacks, while allowing the Corvus boarding device to be deployed with maximum effectiveness. Rowers strained beneath decks, maintaining speed and course while absorbing the shocks of collisions and the chaos of battle. Above, marines stood poised, aware that their survival depended on executing disciplined boarding actions under the most extreme conditions. Deception played a critical role. Roman commanders used feigned retreats and carefully calculated maneuvers to draw Carthaginian vessels into disadvantageous positions. The Carthaginians, eager to capitalize on perceived openings, often pursued aggressively, unaware that they were being guided into traps. The Mediterranean, with its shifting currents and hidden shoals, amplified every error. Ships that misjudged distance or speed were forced into collisions, immobilized, or funneled into zones where Roman formations could dominate. The sea itself became an active participant in the battle, a force that rewarded foresight and punished miscalculation. Ramming tactics initiated the opening phase of the engagement. Bronze prows tore into wooden hulls, splintering timbers and sending sailors into the cold embrace of the Mediterranean. Rowers fought to maintain control under extreme physical strain, while marines prepared to board or repel attackers. Every ship was a microcosm of the larger battle, yet each was interconnected with its neighbors, forming formations that were only as strong as the discipline and endurance of the crews. In Mediterranean naval warfare, a single lapse could trigger catastrophic chain reactions, toppling entire lines of battle. The Corvus boarding device again became a decisive instrument. Roman marines surged across the bridging platforms with deadly coordination, shields interlocked, spears thrust, and swords swinging with lethal precision. Carthaginian sailors, trained for mobility rather than prolonged infantry-style engagement aboard decks, struggled to resist the assault. Ships that had relied on speed and maneuverability found themselves locked in mortal combat. The decks transformed into arenas of chaos and violence. Panic spread rapidly among isolated Carthaginian crews, further amplifying the lethality of Roman tactics. Environmental mastery was crucial. Cape Agathon's waters presented shifting currents, hidden shoals, and variable wind patterns that both fleets had to navigate under extreme duress. Roman commanders, familiar with the region, used these natural conditions to guide enemy vessels into vulnerable positions. Carthaginian ships, overconfident and less disciplined in formation, were pushed toward shallow waters, isolated from reinforcements, and exposed to concentrated boarding actions. In Mediterranean warfare, the ability to exploit natural forces often proved as decisive as any human skill or technological innovation. The human toll was extraordinary. Hundreds of men perished in boarding clashes, drowned in the churning waves, or were crushed beneath falling timbers. Rowers endured relentless physical exertion, often on the brink of collapse, yet maintained synchronization critical for maneuvering. Marines fought with a combination of strength, skill, and endurance atop rolling, waterlogged decks. Officers exposed themselves to enemy fire to issue commands and maintain cohesion, fully aware that a single misjudgment could doom hundreds of lives. Each individual contributed to the collective outcome, highlighting the interdependence of crew, ship, and strategy in Mediterranean naval combat. Carthaginian attempts to counterattack were methodical, yet increasingly desperate. They tried to flank Roman vessels and exploit gaps in formations, but disciplined crews and coordinated Corvus deployments nullified these efforts. Roman ships, supported by relentless human effort and innovative tactics, transformed potential disadvantages into opportunities, capturing or sinking isolated Carthaginian vessels. The sea, once a medium of uncertainty, became an amplifier of Roman discipline and preparation. By the end of the engagement, Roman dominance was clear. The Carthaginian fleet suffered substantial losses, ships sunk or captured, thousands of sailors killed or taken prisoner. Roman casualties, though significant, were manageable, reflecting the combination of superior training, preparation, and disciplined execution. The battle decisively secured Roman control over critical maritime routes in Sicily and demonstrated the evolution of Mediterranean naval warfare. Technology, discipline, environmental mastery, and human endurance integrated into a single, overwhelming strategy. Strategically, the Battle of Cape Agathon reinforced the principle that mastery of the sea determines the trajectory of empires. Control of supply lines, reinforcement routes, and key maritime choke points allowed Rome to project power, sustain campaigns on foreign shores, and neutralize Carthaginian initiatives. Quinqueremes, corvi, bronze rams, and disciplined crews combined to transform the Mediterranean into a stage where human skill and preparation dictated survival and supremacy. The psychological impact was profound. Roman crews endured the brutal realities of naval warfare, yet maintained cohesion and morale, while Carthaginian forces, isolated and demoralized, saw their strategic ambitions crumble. The Mediterranean, with its combination of natural hazards, unpredictability, and lethal dynamics, enforced discipline and punished overconfidence. Survival demanded precision, endurance, and adaptation, a lesson taught in blood and timber at Cape Agathon. Cape Agathon remains a testament to the lethal beauty of Mediterranean naval warfare. It highlights how innovation, discipline, and mastery of environmental conditions can overcome even seasoned adversaries. The battle demonstrated the evolution of Rome into a mature naval power, capable of projecting influence and enforcing strategic objectives across the sea. Every oar stroke, every thrust of a spear, and every maneuver, executed with precision, contributed to an enduring legacy. That the Mediterranean, ever vast and unpredictable, belongs to those who respect, understand, and dominate its relentless dynamics. By sunset, the waters around Cape Agathon were littered with the remnants of timber, splintered hulls, and the bodies of men who had fought and perished in the chaos. Ships, twisted and shattered, floated amidst the bloodied waves, testimony to the violence and high stakes of naval warfare in this era. Yet amid the carnage, Roman discipline and strategy had triumphed, solidifying their dominance and setting the stage for the continued expansion of their Mediterranean empire. The battle remains a stark reminder. In the open sea, victory is measured not merely in numbers or courage, but in preparation, innovation, coordination, and the unyielding mastery of men over both ship and wave. The Strait of Messina, a narrow corridor of turquoise water separating the eastern coast of Sicily from the Italian mainland, has long been a natural choke point where the fate of fleets can be determined by a single miscalculation. In 212 BC, during the Second Punic War, it became the stage for one of the most tense and strategically complex naval engagements in Mediterranean history. Rome, now a seasoned naval power, sought to maintain control over Sicily, ensuring the flow of supplies, troops, and reinforcements. Carthage, determined to disrupt Roman operations and regain its influence in the region, sent a fleet to contest this critical maritime passage. Here, the stakes were immense. Control of the strait meant the difference between victory and strategic paralysis, between life and death for thousands of men aboard hundreds of ships. The Roman fleet, composed primarily of Quinqueremes, was formidable in size and discipline. Each ship carried hundreds of rowers trained to synchronize their oars with the precision required to maintain formation and execute complex maneuvers. Above deck, marines armed with spears, swords, and shields were prepared for the chaos of boarding combat. Bronze rams, polished and sharpened, glinted in the sunlight, capable of piercing hulls and splintering timber with devastating effect. The rowers' muscles burned with every stroke, their lungs straining, yet their coordinated effort allowed the massive vessels to maneuver as a single, lethal organism across the waters of the strait. The Carthaginian fleet, though smaller in number, was composed of experienced sailors and agile triremes, designed for speed and precision. Their crews relied on centuries of seafaring knowledge, including the use of currents, winds, and shoals, to gain tactical advantage. They aimed to exploit the narrowness of the strait to outflank and isolate Roman ships, striking decisively where the larger, heavier Quinqueremes could not respond quickly. The Carthaginians understood that in such confined waters, maneuverability could outweigh brute strength, and they intended to leverage this advantage fully. The engagement began with a tense standoff. The strait, only a few kilometers wide in places, forced both fleets into a deadly proximity where split-second decisions could determine life or death. Roman commanders positioned their ships to maximize control over the choke point, creating overlapping formations that protected flanks while allowing for coordinated offensive action. Rowers synchronized their strokes, keeping vessels aligned while absorbing the shocks of ramming and collision. Marines braced for the boarding that would inevitably follow, knowing that the confined waters made escape difficult and every encounter potentially fatal. Ramming attacks initiated the first phase of combat. Carthaginian triremes darted forward with agility, aiming to strike the sides and sterns of Roman Quinqueremes. Bronze rams collided with wooden hulls, splintering planks, throwing men into the sea and creating immediate chaos. Rowers had to maintain perfect coordination under immense physical strain while adjusting to the sudden changes in ship positioning caused by these collisions. The Mediterranean, in all its deceptive calm, became a stage of intense violence, amplifying mistakes and magnifying human endurance. Roman strategy emphasized the integration of the Corvus, the boarding device that had proven decisive in previous engagements. The Corvus allowed marines to bridge directly onto enemy ships, transforming naval combat into a continuation of land warfare atop unstable rocking decks. Once the boarding bridges were deployed, Roman infantry surged across, shields locking, spears thrusting, swords swinging. Carthaginian crews, trained for speed and maneuvering rather than sustained infantry combat aboard decks, were quickly overwhelmed. Ships became islands of chaos, men grappling in close quarters, shields clashing, timbers splintering, and the sea claiming those who fell. Environmental mastery was central to the battle. The Strait of Messina features treacherous currents and strong tidal shifts, especially in spring and early summer when these engagements took place. Roman commanders had studied these waters meticulously, using the currents to maintain formation and restrict enemy movements. Carthaginian vessels, attempting rapid maneuvers, often found themselves pushed toward shoals or into disadvantageous angles that exposed them to coordinated Roman attacks. Wind, wave, and tidal flow became active participants in the battle, turning natural elements into tactical weapons that favored preparation and discipline over speed and agility alone. The human toll was extraordinary. Hundreds of men perished in boarding skirmishes, crushed beneath masts, or drowned after being thrown into the sea. Rowers endured relentless physical exertion, maintaining the rhythm of their oars even as exhaustion threatened collapse. Marines fought atop rolling, wet decks, balancing skill, strength, and agility in a lethal ballet of close-quarters combat. Officers exposed themselves to enemy fire to maintain cohesion, issuing commands that rippled through hundreds of vessels, ensuring that formations held and momentum was sustained. Every individual action, from a single rower's stroke to a marine's spear thrust, influenced the fate of entire ships and, by extension, the entire engagement. Carthaginian efforts to counterattack were bold yet increasingly desperate. They attempted to flank Roman ships and exploit perceived gaps in formations, but disciplined Roman crews and strategically deployed corvi nullified these efforts. Ships that would have been isolated or overwhelmed were reinforced by coordinated maneuvers, turning potential disadvantage into tactical opportunity. The Mediterranean itself became an amplifier of Roman advantage. Disciplined formations exploited currents, wind, and geography to maximize damage and minimize vulnerability. By the end of the day, Roman dominance was undeniable. Carthaginian ships were sunk, captured, or forced to retreat, while thousands of their sailors were killed or taken prisoner. Roman casualties, though significant, were sustainable, a testament to the effectiveness of training, coordination, and tactical innovation. The battle underscored the evolution of Rome into a naval power capable of sustaining complex operations in narrow, treacherous waters, where both experience and environmental mastery were decisive. Strategically, control of the Strait of Messina was critical. By holding this choke point, Rome ensured the secure movement of troops, supplies, and reinforcements across the Sicilian theater. The Carthaginians, unable to disrupt these lines effectively, were forced to limit their operations and concede initiative to Rome. Quinqueremes, corvi, bronze rams, and disciplined crews combined to transform the Mediterranean into a domain where preparation, coordination, and innovation dictated dominance. Psychologically, the engagement reinforced the principles of Roman naval supremacy. Crews endured extreme physical and mental stress, yet maintained cohesion and morale, while Carthaginian forces, facing repeated boarding and relentless pressure, experienced panic and disarray. The Mediterranean, vast and unforgiving, demanded precision, endurance, and foresight. Success was not measured by courage alone, but by the ability to harmonize human skill with technological innovation and environmental mastery. The Battle of the Strait of Messina remains a vivid example of Mediterranean naval warfare. It highlights the lethal integration of human skill, technological adaptation, and environmental awareness. Rome, through disciplined crews, innovative tactics, and mastery of natural conditions, solidified its control over critical maritime routes and maintained momentum in a protracted conflict against a determined adversary. The engagement illustrates that naval dominance in the Mediterranean is as much about coordination, preparation, and strategic insight as it is about raw numbers or bravery. As night fell over the strait, the waters bore the scars of the engagement, splintered hulls, floating debris, and the bodies of those who had fought and died in the violent contest. Ships, twisted and shattered, drifted among the waves, a testament to the brutality of naval combat. Yet, amid the carnage, Roman discipline and strategic foresight had prevailed, securing a critical victory and reinforcing the principles that had allowed them to dominate the Mediterranean: innovation, endurance, and mastery of both men and the unforgiving sea. The Strait of Messina stands as a testament to the lethal artistry of naval warfare, the power of discipline, and the unforgiving nature of the Mediterranean. It demonstrates that victory is rarely determined by a single act of heroism. It is achieved through preparation, coordination, tactical innovation, and an intimate understanding of the environment. For Rome, this battle represented not merely a tactical victory, but a reinforcement of the naval doctrine that would sustain its dominance across the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The Mediterranean in 255 BC was a theater of unrelenting danger, a corridor where empires measured their strength not by cities alone, but by the mastery of waves, winds, and tides. Near the coast of North Africa, at Cape Bon, the stakes were higher than ever. Rome, intent on extending its reach and threatening Carthaginian heartlands, faced a Carthaginian fleet determined to repel the invaders and protect the empire's maritime lifelines. The waters were calm, glinting under the fierce North African sun, yet this serenity masked the brutal contest about to unfold. On these waters, every oar stroke, every thrust of a spear, and every calculated maneuver could mean life or death, triumph or annihilation. The Roman fleet assembled for this engagement was impressive by contemporary standards: more than 330 Quinqueremes, each a floating fortress manned by hundreds of rowers and marines. Rowers, disciplined through grueling hours of training, labored in precise synchronization, their combined strength driving massive ships through unpredictable currents. Above, marines poised for action stood like statues of deadly intent, shields polished, spears sharpened, and swords ready. The bronze rams at the prow glistened, instruments of destruction capable of piercing wooden hulls and splintering decks with a single collision. For Rome, survival and victory depended as much on coordination and endurance as on the brute strength of these massive vessels. The Carthaginian fleet, though slightly smaller, was formidable in its own right. Its ships were lighter, faster, and manned by seasoned crews who had been trained from childhood to navigate the Mediterranean's fickle currents and treacherous winds. Carthage's strategy emphasized mobility and precision, striking weak points in formations, isolating ships, and exploiting environmental conditions to gain the upper hand. Experienced marines and rowers alike understood that the Mediterranean could be both ally and executioner. Misjudging currents or tidal shifts could mean the loss of an entire ship and the lives aboard it. The battle began with both fleets maneuvering to gain advantage. In these waters, control of the wind and currents was as critical as skillful rowing. Roman commanders arranged their ships in disciplined formations, anticipating Carthaginian attempts to flank or isolate individual vessels. Rowers beneath decks fought through fatigue, adjusting constantly to maintain alignment, speed, and course, while marines readied themselves to exploit every opportunity for boarding. Every movement, every oar stroke, every decision was magnified by the proximity of the opposing fleet and the narrow coastal waters that left little room for error. Initial contact was violent and immediate. Carthaginian triremes darted toward Roman quinqueremes, aiming to ram sides and sterns where hulls were most vulnerable. Bronze rams struck with terrifying force, splintering wood, throwing men into the waves, and creating chaos on decks. The Mediterranean, serene to the observer, became a furnace of violence. Timbers shattered, men screamed, and the water churned, with bodies debris, and blood. Rowers fought to maintain control, their muscles screaming with every stroke, lungs straining for air as the ships pitched and collided. Above them, marines braced for the boarding that would soon determine the battle's outcome. Rome's innovation, the Corvus, once again proved decisive. The massive boarding bridges allowed Roman marines to surge across to enemy ships with lethal efficiency. Shields locked, spears thrust, and swords swung in brutal arcs. Carthaginian crews, trained for mobility and maneuvering rather than sustained infantry-style combat, struggled to repel these assaults. Ships that had relied on speed and precision were immobilized, their decks transformed into deadly arenas where disciplined Roman infantry dictated the outcome. Panic spread through isolated Carthaginian vessels, breaking cohesion and leaving ships vulnerable to capture or destruction. Environmental mastery played a critical role. The waters near Cape Bon are shallow in places, with hidden shoals and complex tidal patterns. Roman commanders used these features strategically, funneling Carthaginian ships into disadvantageous positions. Currents, which could be fatal if misjudged, were anticipated and exploited to maintain formation integrity and enhance offensive potential. Carthaginian vessels, attempting rapid maneuvers, occasionally ran aground or collided with allies, amplifying the chaos and multiplying Roman advantages. The human toll was staggering. Hundreds of men died on decks, crushed beneath splintering masts, or thrown into the sea by collisions. Rowers endured hours of extreme exertion, their bodies screaming in protest, yet the rhythm of the oars had to be maintained. Marines fought in swaying, waterlogged conditions, balancing the ferocity of combat with the instability of the moving platform. Officers exposed themselves to enemy fire, issuing commands with horns, flags, and shouts, maintaining cohesion under circumstances that tested every aspect of leadership and discipline. Each individual's contribution was vital, and mistakes were fatal not only to themselves, but to the entire ship's complement. Carthaginian attempts to break the Roman lines were bold, but increasingly desperate. They sought to flank or isolate ships, hoping to exploit moments of vulnerability. Yet, Roman coordination, disciplined execution, and the strategic use of the Corvus nullified these efforts. Isolated ships were systematically neutralized, captured, or destroyed. The Mediterranean itself became a weapon for the Romans, amplifying the effectiveness of their tactics and punishing enemy miscalculations with swift lethality. By the end of the battle, Roman dominance was clear. The Carthaginian fleet had suffered catastrophic losses, ships sunk, captured, or rendered useless, and thousands of sailors killed or taken prisoner. Roman casualties, while significant, were contained through effective planning, discipline, and execution. Strategically, the victory at Cape Bon solidified Roman control over the waters of the western Mediterranean, disrupting Carthaginian supply lines, securing Sicily's eastern approaches, and demonstrating the maturity of Roman naval power. Psychologically, the battle reinforced Rome's emerging identity as a maritime empire. Roman crews endured extreme physical and mental challenges, maintaining cohesion and morale under conditions that would break lesser forces. Carthaginian crews, despite experience and skill, were overwhelmed by the combination of Roman innovation, discipline, and mastery of both ships and environment. The Mediterranean, indifferent yet ever-present, had tested both sides and validated the supremacy of preparation, coordination, and strategic foresight. The legacy of the Battle of Cape Bon extends far beyond its immediate consequences. It demonstrates the lethal integration of technology, human skill, and environmental mastery. Quinqueremes, corvée, bronze rams, and disciplined crews created a force capable of imposing strategic objectives across the Mediterranean. The battle illustrates a fundamental principle of naval warfare in this era. Victory is determined not by courage or numbers alone, but by coordination, preparation, innovation, and the ability to harmonize human and environmental factors. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the waters around Cape Bon bore witness to the aftermath of the engagement. Shattered timbers, overturned vessels, and the bodies of men who had fought and perished in the chaos. Ships drifted among the wreckage, a testament to both the violence of naval warfare and the endurance of those who survived. Rome had emerged triumphant, securing control over critical maritime routes, demonstrating mastery of the Mediterranean, and reinforcing the principles that would guide its naval doctrine for generations. Cape Bon remains a stark reminder of the deadly art of naval warfare, that mastery of the sea requires preparation, discipline, environmental awareness, and innovation. Here, as in countless other engagements of the era, ships were more than vessels. They were instruments of strategy, courage, and human endurance, capable of shaping the destinies of empires across the vast, unpredictable Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is a theater of contradictions: tranquil, glittering waters that conceal sudden chaos, serene horizons that mask the roar of battle, and endless expanses that amplify both human skill and error. In 256 BC, off the southern coast of Sicily, near the town of Ecnomus, the greatest naval battle of the First Punic War unfolded, a clash of titanic fleets that would determine control of the central Mediterranean and project the destinies of Rome and Carthage for generations. This was a confrontation where tens of thousands of men, hundreds of massive Quinqueremes and triremes, and the unforgiving sea itself all collided in a deadly choreography of strategy, endurance, and raw brutality. Rome, emboldened by recent victories at Cape Hermaeum and Mylae, sought to carry the war directly to the Carthaginian heartland in North Africa. To do so, the Romans assembled a fleet of staggering proportions, estimated at nearly 330 Quinqueremes, carrying more than 80,000 men, including rowers, marines, and support personnel. Each ship was a floating fortress, built to withstand ramming attacks and to serve as a platform for boarding enemy vessels. Rowers, disciplined through months of relentless training, worked in precise unison across 5 banks of oars, their muscles screaming and lungs heaving with each stroke. Above, marines, armed with shields, spears, and swords, stood ready for combat on decks that pitched and rolled with every wave. Bronze rams at the prow, sharpened to deadly perfection, reflected the sun, a forewarning of the destruction they could unleash upon enemy ships. The Carthaginian fleet, though slightly smaller in number, was composed of fast, agile triremes, manned by crews with generations of maritime experience. Their strategy relied on speed, tactical maneuvering, and the ability to exploit gaps in Roman formations. Carthaginian marines, trained for shipboard combat and rapid boarding, relied on a combination of precision and improvisation to offset Roman numerical superiority. They sought to disrupt the Roman advance, isolate individual ships, and strike decisively at vulnerable points, confident that experience, maneuverability, and the natural features of the Mediterranean could turn the tide in their favor. The battle commenced under a dawn sky, the horizon clear and the sea deceptively calm. Roman commanders arranged their fleet in an innovative double-line formation. The main line carried the bulk of the troops and heavy ships, while a secondary line protected the flanks and rear. This strategic formation allowed Rome to maximize the effectiveness of its numbers while guarding against the Carthaginian traditional flanking maneuvers. Rowers synchronized their strokes with machine-like precision, maintaining cohesion across a massive flotilla that stretched for kilometers. Marines waited tensely, fully aware that every misstep could result in death or capture in the chaos that was about to unfold. Initial contact was explosive. Carthaginian triremes darted forward with lethal agility, aiming to strike the sides and sterns of Roman Quinqueremes. Bronze rams collided with wooden hulls, splintering decks, hurling men into the Mediterranean and creating immediate chaos. The noise was deafening, timbers shattering, men screaming, shields clanging, and oars thrashing violently against the water. Rowers fought to maintain synchronization, adjusting to impacts and shifting momentum while pushing their ships into optimal positions. Above, Marines braced for boarding, knowing that every Roman advance could be the difference between victory and annihilation. The Corvus, Rome's signature innovation, once again proved decisive. These massive boarding bridges allowed Roman Marines to surge across to Carthaginian decks with deadly efficiency. Shields interlocked, spears thrust, and swords slashed in close-quarter combat atop decks that pitched violently with every wave. Carthaginian sailors, skilled in maneuver-based combat but unprepared for the ferocity and discipline of Roman infantry-style boarding, were quickly overwhelmed. Ships were transformed into floating battlefields. Chaos, violence, and the stench of blood and seawater mixing as men fought desperately for survival. Panic spread rapidly in isolated Carthaginian vessels, leaving them vulnerable to capture or destruction. Geography and environmental mastery played an essential role. The waters off Ecnomus, with their shifting currents and shallow banks, were carefully studied by Roman commanders. Ships were positioned to exploit these conditions, funneling Carthaginian vessels into areas where ramming and boarding could be executed most effectively. Carthaginian ships attempting high-speed maneuvers often found themselves forced into disadvantageous positions, grounded on shoals, or funneled into concentrated zones of Roman attack. In the Mediterranean, where nature is as much an opponent as the enemy, mastery of currents, wind, and depth could decisively determine the outcome of battle. The human cost was extraordinary. Thousands perished in boarding skirmishes, crushed beneath splintering masts, impaled by spears, or cast into the sea. Rowers labored under extreme physical stress, maintaining the rhythm of their oars despite fatigue that would have felled ordinary men. Marines fought in swaying, waterlogged conditions, balancing combat skill with the instability of their moving platform. Officers exposed themselves to enemy fire, issuing commands to maintain cohesion and direct the fleet, fully aware that any hesitation could doom hundreds. The battle demanded total focus, endurance, and resilience from every individual aboard every ship. Carthaginian efforts to counterattack were daring but increasingly desperate. Attempts to flank Roman ships, exploit gaps, or isolate segments of the fleet were met with coordinated Roman resistance. Quinqueremes, with their superior stability and the lethal capability of the Corvus, systematically neutralized Carthaginian maneuvers. Ships were captured, sunk, or forced to retreat. The sea, far from a neutral medium, became a weapon in the hands of those disciplined enough to master it. Currents, tides, and waves amplified Roman coordination and punished Carthaginian overconfidence. By the end of the day, the scale of Roman victory was staggering. Estimates suggest that Rome captured or sank nearly half of the Carthaginian fleet, with thousands of sailors and marines killed or taken prisoner. Roman casualties were heavy but sustainable, testament to meticulous planning, disciplined execution, and superior training. Strategically, the Battle of Ecnomus enabled Rome to safely transport troops across the Mediterranean to Africa, laying the groundwork for the eventual invasion of Carthaginian territory and signaling Rome's emergence as a dominant maritime power. Psychologically, the battle reinforced the supremacy of Roman naval doctrine. Crews endured brutal conditions, extreme stress, and constant exposure to death, yet maintained cohesion, morale, and relentless aggression. Carthaginian forces, despite centuries of maritime experience, were overwhelmed by the integration of Roman innovation, discipline, and strategic insight. The Mediterranean, vast and indifferent, had tested both fleets and validated the supremacy of preparation, coordination, and mastery of both man and sea. The legacy of the Battle of Ecnomus is monumental. It demonstrates the lethal combination of technological innovation, disciplined manpower, environmental mastery, and strategic foresight. Quinqueremes, corvi, bronze rams, and disciplined crews allowed Rome to impose its will across vast maritime theaters. The battle illustrates a fundamental principle of Mediterranean naval warfare. Victory is not determined by courage or numbers alone, but by preparation, coordination, and the ability to harness human skill in harmony with environmental conditions. As the sun sank below the horizon, the waters off Ecnomus were littered with the remnants of ships, debris, and the bodies of men who had fought and died in one of history's largest naval battles. The scale of destruction was immense, yet amid the carnage, Roman discipline and strategic foresight had prevailed. Control of the sea had been secured, not through luck or sheer audacity, but through preparation, endurance, and the lethal integration of man, ship, and environment. Ecnomus remains a testament to the deadly artistry of Mediterranean naval warfare. It encapsulates the evolution of Roman maritime power, the integration of innovation with discipline, and the human cost of domination at sea. This battle, like so many in the Mediterranean, demonstrates that mastery of the waves is as decisive as mastery of land, that ships are more than vessels. They are instruments of strategy, courage, and endurance capable of shaping the destinies of empires. The Mediterranean, ever beautiful yet merciless, had once again decided the fates of men and nations, and Rome had emerged triumphant, ready to continue its rise as a maritime superpower.